If you were erased from the very place you helped build, would you stay silent or return with the proof that could shake an entire system? One man did just that and made the institution tremble. His name is Ezekiel Zeke Monroe, and what you're about to witness isn't a story about success. It's a story about exposure. This is the story of the gatekeeper. If this is your first time on my channel, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And if you're into true stories that flip the script and defy expectations, hit that subscribe button and join the journey. Thank you for being here. And now, let's step into today's story. At exactly 10:17 a.m., inside the executive conference room on the 15th floor of St. Mercy Medical Center, tension hung thick in the air. The board of directors sat hunched over a critical emergency meeting on the upcoming quarter's financials, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass that reflected the bright Louisiana sun. Pens scratched across expensive wood, and no one at the table suspected that this morning would mark the end of an era and the beginning of a truth long buried. The glass door swung open. An elderly man wearing a worn light blue janitor's uniform, shoulders slightly hunched, shoes still dusted with residue from the ER corridor, walked in with a slow but deliberate stride. "You've got the wrong floor, Mr. Monroe," said Dr. Preston Callahan, the young chief executive officer, lifting his eyes from the head of the table with a smirk. "Executive meetings don't need mops." A few chuckles scattered around the room. Everyone knew Zeke, that old floor guy seen from the entrance of the ICU, but no one ever really noticed him. To them, he was as much a fixture of the hospital as the tiles underfoot or the directional signs on the wall. Zeke said nothing. He calmly placed a weathered leather briefcase on the table. The edges were frayed, the clasp slightly dented, but when he opened it, every gaze was instantly drawn to what lay inside, a stack of documents carefully sealed in moisture-proof sleeves. On top sat a certificate of ownership, stamped in red, bearing the signature of Dr. Malcolm Callahan, the hospital's founder and Preston's late father. The air went still, like it had been strangled. Naomi Brooks, the hospital's legal counsel, leaned forward and studied the certificate closely. "This can't be," someone from the board whispered. Zeke looked each of them in the eye. His gaze no longer belonged to the man forgotten behind a mop. It was the look of someone who had seen everything and was done staying silent. "This is a legal certificate of ownership for 51% of St. Mercy Medical Center," Zeke said, his voice low, gravelly, and steady with age. "Signed by Malcolm Callahan on May 3rd, 1989. Dr. Preston Callahan shot to his feet, voice cracking. "Is this some kind of joke? Are you dreaming out loud?" Zeke calmly pulled out another sheet, a handwritten letter, the ink bold, the penmanship unmistakable to many in the room. It was Malcolm's. "Zeke Monroe is the one I trust most. If I'm ever gone, he will keep the soul of this hospital on course." No one laughed now. Only the steady ticking of the wall clock filled the room, echoing between stunned stares from people who had never bothered to look him in the eye. By that afternoon, word of the janitor, who's actually a founding shareholder, had spread like a shockwave through the entire St. Mercy Medical Center. And throughout the halls, a name once only whispered over mop buckets was now on every tongue: Zeke Monroe. On the 7th floor, inside the legal affairs office, Naomi Brooks, 28 years old, sharp-minded, round glasses wearing legal assistant, was quietly brewing coffee while combing through the hospital's internal document archive. After sending a message to her close friend, Carlos Espinoza, the data systems technician, Zeke just dropped a nuclear bomb in the boardroom. She felt an urgent pull to dig deeper. Founder, Ezekiel A. Monroe. Naomi whispered as a search result popped up on her screen in the digital archives. It was real. His name appeared in the 1988 founding records of the hospital, right alongside two familiar ones, Malcolm Callahan and Dr. Eliza Whitmore. But what chilled her was the final entry in the shareholder update log. Date removed from system, April 7, 1993. Action by M. Callahan. Reason, internal transfer. Not public. Naomi's eyes widened. Not public. A founder erased from the system with no formal resolution, no financial record? She immediately called Carlos. "You were right," Naomi said urgently. Zeke was one of the original 3 founders. His name was scrubbed from the system in 1993, The same year Malcolm Callahan took over full operational control, Carlos went silent for a beat. So, he spent his life working under his own name, buried beneath a building he helped create. Not just that, Naomi added, her voice shaking with restrained anger. If the documents he brought to the boardroom this morning are original, then for over 30 years, this hospital has been running on institutional deception. Naomi said nothing more, but in her eyes, a plan had begun to form, not just to restore justice for Zeke, but to bring every shadow that had been swept into the dark into the light. That evening, in a small apartment in the Tremaine neighborhood, Zeke Monroe sat quietly, staring at an old photograph on the wall. In the photo were three people. Himself, then in his early 30s, hair still jet black, wearing a white lab coat, Malcolm Callahan, with a calm demeanor and radiant smile, and Eliza Whitmore, a prominent resident physician known for her deep ties to the New Orleans medical community. The photo was taken the day they inaugurated St. Mercy, back when the hospital was just a modest 3-story building with a tight budget, but dreams bigger than the sky. The path we built, they twisted it to serve their will, Zeke murmured, gently touching the photograph. He didn't harbor rage for being cut out of the paperwork. He didn't resent being demoted to janitor. What had kept him silent for all these years was a promise. In 1993, Eliza died in a car crash, officially ruled a technical malfunction, on her way to a medical conference. But in the years that followed, troubling details emerged. Her car had recently been serviced at a garage funded by Preston Callahan, and just weeks earlier, Eliza had publicly opposed Malcolm's proposal to sign with a private insurance conglomerate, a move that would turn the entire hospital system into a commercial enterprise. After Eliza's death, Zeke was torn. He suspected it wasn't just an accident, but without concrete proof, there was nothing he could do. Grieving and full of doubt, he chose to step down from his executive role. Not because he was forced out, but because of a promise he made to Eliza. If anything happens to me, look after the girl, and keep this hospital independent. Zeke kept his word. He gave up his title as co-founder, asking only to remain in the hospital as a logistics worker, quietly watching, quietly protecting. He believed Malcolm would uphold the original ideals in his place, to keep the hospital free from privatization, to never commercialize human health. But Malcolm didn't keep his word. After Eliza's death and Zeke's withdrawal, Malcolm swiftly manipulated documents, removed Zeke's name from the shareholder registry, and began negotiating with insurance companies, pharmaceutical giants, and financial conglomerates. The deals prioritized profits over patients, an utter betrayal of everything they had once stood for. He also brought his son, Preston Callahan, into the system early on, grooming him to be the heir to the medical legacy, despite Preston's lack of skill, empathy, or moral compass. And Preston, the privileged son, grew up inside a lie. That evening, Zeke stood up and took off the old janitor uniform hanging by the door. He knew he wouldn't be wearing it again, not because he thought he was above it, but because the truth needed a voice. And he knew it was time. News of that morning's boardroom meeting spread like wildfire through the halls of St. Mercy Medical Center. But this time, it wasn't about a rare liver transplant or a miracle ER save. It was about Zeke Monroe, the man everyone once called the old guy with the mop, who had just done the unthinkable. In a cramped break room behind the anesthesiology wing, head nurse Darlene Pearson slowly lowered her coffee cup, her eyes still locked on her phone screen. "He actually owned shares from day one," she whispered, as if trying to convince herself. "And they erased him from the system for nearly 30 years. Beside her, Terrence, a diagnostic imaging tech, gave a bitter chuckle. "When I first started back in 2007, Dr. Callahan straight up told me, 'Your kind is best kept in the basement.' For years, people like them, orderlies, transport staff, night shift nurses, had silently endured. No one spoke up, out of fear, out of futility, because in this place, their voices never seemed loud enough to matter. But Zeke's unexpected appearance in the executive boardroom had cracked open the silence that had lasted far too long. That afternoon, when Zeke stepped out of the elevator on the first floor, the eyes that used to pass right through him now followed him with quiet reverence. A young nurse bowed her head in greeting, something that hadn't happened once in 30 years. "I'm not doing this for applause," Zeke said softly to Carlos, a young systems engineer at the hospital, as the two stood looking through the ICU observation window. "I'm doing it because too many good people have been overlooked. Too many dreams have been crushed by bias." Carlos nodded, his expression serious. He was leading a small, quiet team tasked with tracing financial data and alter records. The first puzzle pieces were falling into place. In 1993, the same year Dr. Callahan's father took full control, Zeke's name vanished from a founding shareholder list. At the same time, aggressive cost-cutting and benefit rollback began, transforming the hospital from a community center into a commercial engine. Darlene, Terrence, Carlos, one by one, they began telling their stories of being dismissed in board meetings, of having shifts cut without explanation, of being called "you people" instead of by name. Zeke wasn't just coming back to reclaim ownership. He had come first to stand up and say, "I was forgotten, but I won't let anyone else be." Within 48 hours of that fateful board meeting, the name Zeke Monroe flooded internal chat threads and even made its way to local news headlines with clickbait titles like, "Janitor claims ownership of city's largest hospital. Hero or hoax?" On social media, a spliced clip from security camera footage showed Zeke placing his documents on the boardroom table, captioned, "Delusional dreams of a mop man." Hours later, a wave of anonymous accounts posted allegations that Zeke had once been sued for document forgery, even hinting that he was exploiting his age and background for sympathy fame. And behind it all, no surprise, Dr. Callahan. "I can't let a confused old man and a pile of dusty papers undermine the foundation of this institution," Callahan declared in an emergency Zoom meeting, his tense face filling the screen like he was mid-surgery. "My lawyers are preparing a defamation and impersonation lawsuit." Zeke said nothing. He didn't have a media team or polished PR advisors. But he had something they didn't: the truth. And the truth arrived, quietly, in the small frame of Leona Pierce, the veteran head of accounting who'd been with the hospital since the very beginning. That afternoon, Leona, 60 years old, always in a beige cardigan and carrying a weathered file tote, walked into Zeke's modest office. "I thought you'd never come back," she said, placing a wooden archive box on his desk. Inside were original copies of the founding contracts from 1988, bearing the handwritten signatures of Malcolm Callahan, Dr. Callahan's father, and a second name, Ezekiel Monroe. Alongside them, a shareholder meeting transcript dated 1989, clearly outlining the equity split: 51% for Zeke, 39% for Malcolm, and 10% for Eliza Whitmore. "I've kept these for over 30 years, Leona said, eyes narrowing. "Back then, Malcolm made me redo the financial records to simplify the system, which meant erasing you from all official databases. I stayed silent because I needed the job, but now I have nothing left to lose." That evening, Carlos and Naomi, the sharp young legal aide, scanned the entire set of documents, sending them to an independent law firm and 3 federal oversight agencies. Included was a sworn affidavit from Leona. Within a week, the balance of power began to shift. When asked by a local reporter about the accusations made against him, Zeke merely gave a soft smile. "I don't need to shout to be heard," he said. "All I needed was a signature, and the honesty of a woman who was once forced to forget what justice looked like." The battle wasn't over. But for the first time, public opinion began to lean toward a man who had once been deemed invisible. 3 days after Leona Pierce confirmed the legality of Zeke Monroe's ownership stake, St. Mercy Medical Center fell into a strange state of limbo. The air seemed heavier, hallways grew quieter, and staff eyes turned cautious whenever Dr. Callahan or Zeke passed by. Outside, media coverage picked up speed, dividing public opinion into 2 camps. One side calling Zeke the stolen founder, the other suggesting this was a fabricated stunt to extort the hospital. That night, a video began circulating on social media. It showed Zeke speaking with a security officer in the parking lot. The clip was cleverly edited, making it seem like Zeke was offering a bribe. "We can settle this quietly, as long as I can get back into the admin office," his voice said, spliced out context. Before Zeke could issue a response, the local news station aired the video on the banner headline: Janitor or mastermind? A clear PR strike from Callahan's camp. But in the shadows, a quiet counterattack was already underway. Carlos, the systems engineer Zeke had trusted from the beginning, had access to the hospital's full backup servers. While combing through the internal logs, he noticed suspicious alterations to the accounting database. Files with tampered timestamps, all edited around 2 a.m. the night after Zeke went public. The deeper he dug, the more disturbing the findings became. More than $12 million in employee benefit funds meant for healthcare staff had been siphoned off since 2019, funneled into a private firm called Solace Ventures. The listed CEO, Nathan Callahan, Dr. Callahan's younger brother. Carlos captured every transaction, access ID, and timestamp, transferring the files to a separate drive. But instead of reporting it directly to the executive board, he went to the only person he trusted, Zeke, down on the ground floor near the maintenance wing, where Zeke often quietly remopped corners overlooked by others. Carlos handed him a small USB and whispered, "I don't know exactly what I've stumbled into, but if what I found is real, they've been stealing from the very people who keep this hospital running." Zeke studied him for a long moment, then gave a single, steady nod. "Thank you for not looking away." That night, Zeke asked Naomi and a trusted legal advisor from Orleans Parish to review the files. It took less than 3 hours. Everything checked out. Not just financial manipulation, but employee fund theft and large-scale money laundering. Zeke sat in silence, staring out the window. Turns out the dirtiest thing here isn't the floor. He knew now, this wasn't just a battle over legacy. It was a final war between integrity and organized greed. Before dawn broke on Monday, the phone in Zeke Monroe's modest office rang. On the other end was a familiar voice, low, clipped, urgent. "We received the files." And Zeke, not a single word of yours was exaggerated. The caller was Victor Granger, a veteran federal investigator with the FBI's Southeast Division, and Zeke's old friend from their days serving in a civilian oversight team during Hurricane Katrina. For over 2 decades, they had kept in touch, sometimes with just a handwritten letter, sometimes with a single phone call. "I'll be there in 24 hours. And this time, we're not knocking politely. At exactly 7:52 a.m., while the morning shift was still prepping handoffs, a line of black SUVs with government plates pulled up to the front entrance of St. Mercy Medical Center. Before anyone could react, FBI agents, federal financial inspectors, and federal audit officers poured out, warrants in hand, eyes sweeping the buildings like they'd studied blueprints. Panic spread to the hospital like wildfire. Local news crews arrived within 10 minutes. No one knew who tipped them off, but it sure wasn't Zeke's team. Dr. Preston Callahan, moments away from delivering a keynote at an internal summit on the 6th floor, was escorted off the podium and asked to surrender all electronic devices. His personal bodyguard was detained outside the hallway. Key staffers, including Frank DeMarco, head of administration, were ordered off-site pending investigation. In the basement server room, Carlos Espinoza walked federal agents through the systems, providing passcodes and verified backups of the stolen data. When Victor Granger stepped in, his eyes paused on a quiet young man hunched over a terminal. "So it was you?" Granger smiled, nodding slowly. "You have no idea how big this is." In the east corridor, Zeke stood silently, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. And when his eyes met Preston Callahan's across the stairwell, time itself seemed to stop. Callahan tried to keep his rage in check, but his face had turned a shade of red only fury could paint. "You think you've won, Monroe? This little stunt won't last." Zeke answered calmly, voice steady as stone. "This isn't about me winning. It's about the truth returning to where it belongs." An hour later, the executive boardroom, where Zeke had once quietly placed the original documents before the hospital's leadership, was sealed off. Federal agents combed through every hard drive, every folder, even the dusty filing cabinets in the mechanical level 2 floors below. By noon, the local news led with the headline, "FBI raid St. Mercy Medical Center. Alleged embezzlement of employee benefit funds under investigation." Doctors, nurses, and technicians across departments sat in break rooms staring at the broadcast, stunned. Many glanced at each other in disbelief. Zeke's words, once dismissed as the ramblings of a janitor with too much time and too little sense, now rang as warnings. Warnings they should have heard. Warnings they couldn't ignore anymore. And for the first time in over 3 decades, silence was no longer the loudest thing echoing through St. Mercy's hallways. 3 days after the FBI raid, the atmosphere inside St. Mercy Medical Center still hadn't settled. The once quiet corridors now buzzed with whispered conversations, cautious footsteps, and the soft clatter of doors closing, a soundscape of uncertainty and reckoning. Downstairs, a temporary data analysis room had been set up. It was there that Leona Pierce, longtime head of accounting, stepped in with an aged, black external hard drive clutched tightly in her hand. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her eyes held firm resolve. "I've had this since 2014, Leona said, placing the device on the table before investigator Victor Granger. "I never thought I'd have to use it, but I can't stay silent anymore." Inside the drive was a trove of internal recordings, private meetings between Dr. Preston Callahan, Chief Administrator Frank DeMarco, and Cliff Monroe, chair of the board. The files captured in disturbing detail the strategic siphoning of funds from employee benefit accounts into a shell company named Solace Ventures, registered in Delaware and headed by none other than Nathan Callahan, Preston's brother. One conversation, crackling faintly through the speaker, stood out. "They don't read the fine print, Frank. We skim 3% a quarter, log it as internal reinvestment costs. And we're good. And Zeke's portion? That relic? He was erased from the books back when my father ran this place. No one remembers who the hell he even was." Victor frowned and turned to Carlos Espinoza, who was still working to recover data from the original server. "These recordings match the system logs," Carlos nodded. "And there's more. I found traces of hidden encryption in the accounting software. They created a false entry chain to cover up the transferred funds." At the same time, a printed document retrieved from long-term storage, signed by Leona Pierce in 1989, confirmed Zeke Monroe's 51% ownership stake, which had been invalidated by an internal memo in 1994 citing medical reasons. However, no medical records were attached. "The evidence aligns," Victor said slowly, "and it's enough for prosecution." That afternoon, major news outlets like CNN and NBC simultaneously aired the story. New whistleblower evidence alleges embezzlement at St. Mercy Medical Center. CEO and 2 board members facing federal charges. When the first audio recordings were broadcast nationwide, a wave of public outrage surged across the country. On social media, healthcare workers everywhere voiced their support using the hashtags. Hashtag Justice for Zeke. Hashtag Voices of the Unseen. A nurse at St. Mercy wrote, "We've served this hospital with sweat and tears. But the only person who stood up for us was the one no one ever saw." That evening, Zeke sat alone by the window in the old supply shed, the place where he used to rest during late-night cleaning shifts. His gaze wandered toward the soft yellow lights in the distance, the intensive care unit, not because he longed to look back, but because, at last, the unheard were being heard. He didn't have to shout to win justice. He just had to open the right box and let the truth speak for itself. On a freezing Monday morning in early March, the federal courthouse of New Orleans opened the official hearing in Zeke Monroe's case against Dr. Preston Callahan and 2 board members of St. Mercy Medical Center. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps. Cameras pointed at the 70-year-old black man ascending, not in his janitor's uniform, but in a charcoal gray suit, simple yet dignified. "Did you really ever own the hospital, Mr. Monroe?" one reporter shouted. Zeke paused, looked straight into the camera, and smiled faintly. Calm certainty glimmered in his eyes. "I never used to own it. I never lost it." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Dr. Preston Callahan sat at the defendant's table, face pale, hands gripping his briefcase. Flanking him were Frank DeMarco and Cliff Monroe, both equally shaken. Zeke's attorney, Amira Bennett, opened with a quote from the 1988 founding charter of the hospital. This facility was founded by 3 individuals under the guiding principle: Healing with heart, not just with technology. And the first signature on that charter was Ezekiel Monroe. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as the original document was presented, accompanied by a grainy but irrefutable video recording of the signing ceremony at a law office decades ago. A young Zeke captured on tape, placing his signature beside Malcolm Callahan, Preston's father. The defense countered, arguing that the document holds no legal authority since no transfer of management was registered after 1993. But then Leona Pierce, who had served as chief accountant during that era, took the witness stand, her voice unwavering. I was ordered to delete Mr. Monroe's records when Dr. Malcolm Callahan abruptly assumed full control. I objected and was reassigned to a lower department, but I kept a verified backup from the original system. When the internal recording played in the courtroom, Preston Callahan's dismissive laughter echoing as he said, "Zeke's just a janitor who knows when to stay quiet." A quiet wave of outrage rippled through the chamber. After 3 tense days of litigation, the jury retired to deliberate. They returned in just over 5 hours. The presiding judge stood and read the verdict in a solemn tone. The court finds that Mr. Ezekiel Monroe is the rightful owner of 51% of St. Mercy Medical Center. Mr. Preston Callahan, Mr. Frank DeMarco, and Mr. Cliff Monroe are hereby indicted on charges of embezzlement of employee benefit funds, falsification of corporate records, and willful concealment of federal evidence. They are ordered to pay a total of $18.5 million in restitution and are subject to further criminal investigation. In that moment, Zeke didn't smile. He simply nodded, placing his hand on the folder he had carried for more than 3 decades. The man once dismissed as just a janitor now stood at the center of the courtroom, not as a victor, but as a symbol of endurance, justice, and a memory that refused to be buried. Behind him, Leona Pierce and Naomi Brooks quietly wiped away tears. Carlos Espinoza clenched his fists, overwhelmed with pride. Across the hospital, hundreds of healthcare workers watched the live stream, in break rooms, hallways, and cafeterias, and stood up applauding, not for a verdict, but for the man who had once been forgotten. 3 weeks after the historic trial, the atmosphere at St. Mercy Medical Center had shifted entirely. The hospital's once tense corridors now felt lighter, as though the dust of time and injustice had finally been wiped away. Contrary to what many expected, Zeke Monroe did not walk into the executive office with a list of people to fire. He terminated no one except the 3 individuals convicted in the criminal case: Dr. Preston Callahan, Frank DeMarco, and Cliff Monroe. "I didn't come back for revenge," Zeke said during the first all-staff meeting as the rightful owner of St. Mercy. "I came to rebuild from the ground up." During the meeting, he announced the first wave of reforms: a 22% increase in base salary for all custodial, nursing, maintenance, and technical staff effective next quarter. The establishment of the Leona Pierce Training Fund, named after the veteran nurse who was forced into early retirement for speaking out against injustice. The fund would help cover educational expenses for nursing staff seeking to advance their qualifications. The launch of the Ezekiel Medical Scholarship Program, exclusively for students from underserved minority communities, with a commitment to return and serve their local communities after graduation. "When I was young," Zeke said, his voice deep and weather-like wind blowing through the windows of the old hospital, "I dreamed of studying medicine, but life had other plans. Today, I want to make sure that dream doesn't end with me." The applause that followed echoed to the hall, not because of policy, but because, for the first time, they knew someone who truly understood them was leading the hospital. Carlos Espinoza, now appointed as Director of IT and Data Security, stood quietly in the crowd, his eyes filled with hope. Naomi Brooks had been promoted to Head of Legal Affairs, and Leona Pierce, after 30 silent years as an accountant, was publicly appointed as Chief Financial Officer. Zeke refused to use Dr. Callahan's old office. Instead, he requested his desk be moved to the ground floor, right next to the logistics hub and reception area. "To run a hospital," he smiled, "you have to start where people first walk in." With reforms built not just on policy but on trust, St. Mercy Medical Center had entered a new chapter, one where human dignity came first. And everyone understood this wasn't a coup. It was a lesson in patience, honor, and belief in what's right. On Friday afternoon, the main atrium of St. Mercy Medical Center was filled wall to wall. From janitors and technicians and nurses and resident doctors, everyone had gathered for the inaugural celebration of Silent Founders Day, a new annual tradition created by the restructured leadership team to honor those who built the foundation of the hospital with sweat, loyalty, and silence. Soft lights washed over the modest stage in the center of the atrium. Amid unending applause, Zeke Monroe stepped up to the podium, slow but steady, without assistance. He still wore the same gray suit from the day of the trial, but today, pinned to his chest was a small silver badge, St. Mercy, 1988. His voice, deep and resolute, carried through the hall as he began. I used to mop blood off the operating room floors of my own hospital. Today, I'm still cleaning, but it's a stain of deception I'm wiping away. The entire hall fell silent. Zeke looked toward the back, where Carlos, Naomi, Leona Pierce, and a group of young staff members stood. People once seen as outsiders, now the heart of the hospital's new leadership. Some people ask why I didn't retaliate, didn't fire anyone, didn't put a statue of myself out front, he said. I only answer this because I don't need recognition. I need justice. And true justice is when all of you, the ones who were once overlooked, can now walk up on the stage without bowing, without asking permission. He stepped to the side and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. Then he placed it directly in Naomi's hands. This is a document transferring 40% of the hospital's executive authority to the next generation. I can't walk this path forever, but I believe you'll walk it right. The applause that followed wasn't for the gesture. It was for what everyone knew. Zeke wasn't just passing down power. He was handing over an unspoken dream. A new bronze plaque was mounted beneath his portrait in the center of the atrium. It read, Zeke Monroe, the Forgotten Founder, a leader who spoke through silence. And from that day on, every new employee who stepped through the gates of St. Mercy learned one thing first. Not from a handbook, not from a syllabus. Respect begins by seeing the people no one else sees. Never underestimate the ones standing quietly behind the door. They may have built the entire house. In a world full of noise, sometimes silence is the strongest voice of justice, of dignity, and of a truth that refuses to be buried.